Today I'll tell a true scary story. Listen carefully, relax, and sleep easy. I first learned the forest has a memory the summer I turned 16. Up until then, forests had been places of routine. Hiking trails with blisters at the end, scout camps with canned songs, a backyard line of oaks where baseballs lodged and summers smelled like cut grass. But the trees outside of town are different. Out there the light moves slower, the wind carries old conversations, and the dark isn't an absence so much as a presence. It waits, and when you camp inside that waiting, you discover you are not the only thing holding breath. My name is Luke Harper. I grew up in a small town tucked under the ridge of the Greenfield Range, halfway between the interstate and a river that no one ever seemed to fish in. My parents worked hours that bent time, Mom at the hospital, Dad at the mill. We were a family of whispered plans and weekends swallowed by yard work. I learned to find my own quiet. For most of my life, that quiet had been the church lot at dusk, the bleachers at midnight, the attic with a flashlight and dog-eared comics. I'd read the survival guides, memorized knots, watched every wilderness video the internet could stream. I fancied myself prepared for anything a weekend in the woods could throw at me. So when Mr. Harris from the school, our history teacher, who had a hand like a weathered book and a voice that smelled faintly of menthol, offered a place on his summer trip, I said yes before the thought was finished. It was billed as a last rites rite of passage. 3 nights, a stretch of federal forest 2 hours north where cell reception danced like a rumor and the old ranger station still used paper logs. The trip promised a fire circle, late-night confessions, and a chance to stand in the dark and call your name and listen for the echo to come back wrong. We were teenagers, too skeptical to be afraid and too eager to be brave. We packed into Mr. Harris's van on a Friday afternoon, the back seat full of sleeping bags, coolers, and the kind of nervous jokes that sit heavy with teenage bravado. The other students, Maya, who could fix a car alternator with a paperclip, Jared, always with a camera, Nina, who laughed with her whole mouth, felt like a team drafted for mischief. We sang along with radio songs until the trees closed in and the cell phone bars dropped. The highway surrendered to a 2-lane road, then to gravel, then to the thin, ribbon trail that led to the ranger's lot. The ranger's lot had a ranger cabin painted a tired green and a rusted sign that warned of bears and of fires. We signed the paper log like nervous actors rehearsing a line that promised safety. The ranger, an older woman with skin like newsprint and a hat that belonged to another era, told us the usual. Don't feed the animals, keep clean, leave no trace. But when she turned from us and waved to the trees in a way that suggested she was more comfortable with wood than with people, I felt the first shift. There was an apology in the air, like the land itself held regrets. We hiked in the afternoon, each step a small exile. Sunlight lay on the trail as a stripe of warmth, and the world smelled of pine and damp earth and the metallic tang of copper left by old mining. We set the campsite beside a creek that made a careful, endless argument with the stones. Someone set up a hammock, someone else a tent, and I, stubborn as always, claimed a roped spot near the old growth, because something about older trees felt like pressing a hand against the past. Night came quick and honest. The sky stitched itself with stars. The Milky Way looked like a smear left by a careless paintbrush. We started the fire. The circle closed. Someone pulled a guitar from behind the cooler, and for a while we were small and clean, our voices bouncing in the glow. Later, when the laughter thinned into a companionable quiet, Mr. Harris told us to jot down something we'd never told anyone. We wrote on yellow paper under headlamps that made the world theatrical and fragile. Around midnight, after the others had dissolved into tents and sleeping bags and finally, the muffled sleep of teenagers, I lay awake and listened. The forest breathed. Owls traded notes overhead. The creek rehearsed its soft staccato. Far off, something thumped. Maybe a deer, maybe a log shifting. I counted the hours like coins, and every few minutes I told myself to sleep. My eyes would close and then convince themselves they were opening. When they did, I caught a sliver of movement at the edge of the firelight. A silhouette, long and swaying, like a person seen through rippling glass. I blinked hard. The silhouette blinked back. I told myself it was trees in the wind. I told myself everything reasonable teenagers tell themselves at 1 in the morning when they are used to the insulation of streetlights and the white noise of their own houses. But soon the rational thread thinned. The silhouette came closer. Not a person, not an animal, but something that wore movement like a second skin. It paused at the tree line, where light failed and the dark became a wall. For a while it stood there, keeping company with the shadow. By morning the world had reasserted itself. Sunlight was every forgiving thing. The others yawned and cooked coffee. The guitar sat emboldened by yesterday's songs. We compared stories of imagined terrors, laughing like it had all been a script we had read too fast. I wanted to tell them about the silhouette, to announce it as proof I had felt the forest breathe differently. But words felt too warm and thin. I made coffee and kept the thought like an ember under my tongue. The second night was when the rules started to break. We had hiked a little farther, deeper into the reserve, following a trail that narrowed and split and finally unraveled into a place that had no real map. Everyone had brought their own little rituals. Maya's was a compass she spun whenever she felt lost. Jared's was a camera that came with a soft obsession. Nina's was her laugh, which used to hang at the rim of things and then fall free into the trees. We built another fire and traded ghost stories as the blackberry bushes sharpened their silhouettes under the moon. The air changed around dusk in a way I didn't notice at first. It was like someone had lowered the tone on the forest and asked the birds to stay home. The crickets quieted and the creek began to whisper less like water and more like a rumor. We kept talking, but our words dripped into a different silence. They no longer found traction. Then the first thing happened. One of the trees across the hollow produced a sound like a knuckle rapping wood. Then another. Then, as if given permission, a series of soft knocks traveled along the trunks. 3, like a question. Then 2, like an answer. We joked, of course. Jared said it was Morse code from a romantic deer. Maya knocked back, tapping a rhythm on her thigh to see if anything would respond. We were kids arranging chaos into laughter. But then the knocks changed. They sped up, then slowed, and a pattern, frighteningly deliberate, began. It was heavy where the bark was thin, a kind of percussion that felt almost communicative. Then a different sound floated in from the deeper dark, the scrap of fabric, like someone brushing northern shirts against bark. A shape moved just beyond the reach of the fire. Maya went quiet. Even in the dark you could see it in her posture. She had the way of a fox that freezes before it bolts. We turned our heads together in a motion that made the fire crackle and sent a scat of sparks into the air. For one breath the forest held something patient and then, impossibly, the shape stepped forward into the light. Not unarmed, not without purpose. It was tall, too tall for comfort, and its limbs were oddly long, as if some childhood drawing had been stretched. It had a head casing of hair or perhaps a hood, hard to tell, and it moved with the awkward dignity of someone who had learned how to walk from eavesdroppers. No one screamed. We are Americans. That's our little cultural superstition. We shout less and document more. Jared, who never missed a chance to objectify danger into images, raised his camera. The flash popped, a tiny bulb of defiance. The creature, or whatever it was, stuttered in front of the light and then, as if offended, tilted its head. It made a sound, low and something between a whistle and a throat cleared. It was not the sound of an animal I'd ever heard. We watched each other. The world brightened and dimmed with calculation. Mr. Harris, who had taught survival and civic responsibility, took the lead like the old railroads in him bothered to move. He told us to gather the sleeping bags, pack up silently, and move down the trail. We obeyed. Our hearts climbed into our mouths. The forest, which had seemed only to make small, polite mischief the night before, was now deliberate. We moved in whispers and practiced the script of silence we had learned from too many movies. Quiet steps, slower breathing, a formation that reduced visibility. The creature followed at a distance, never bold enough to close the gap, but close enough that the leaves it brushed carried smells we couldn't name. By the time we reached the creek, the morning was a promise. We were near a ranger cabin, a phone signal, a world of pavement and reason. The smell of coffee drifted from the station like a promise. But the forest refused to let go. When we reached the ranger's lot, the logbook on the porch had been opened and a single new entry scrawled in the margin. The handwriting was wrong, too small, too neat, like somebody had practiced too much. It read, "Luke, don't forget." The words were in ink so old it felt blue-blooded against the paper. The rational mind constructs houses to keep nightmares in. We laughed it off as prank, a writing sample left by some bored visitor, and the ranger a different woman that morning. A younger man who seemed on shift because the old ranger had gone into town. Took pity and gave us a spare coffee and an embarrassed shrug. He blamed local kids. We went back into the green with our guard slightly raised and our self-respect slightly dented. Night 3 arrived with a different cast. We set our tents on a ridge that looked over a basin of trees, enticing and full of possibilities. I had slept little that day on adrenaline on the extra coffee. We circled the fire with soft lights and stronger, more intentional talk. We traded the kind of stories friends tell around a flame to play courage into being. Somewhere between the second and third hour of the night, after the laughs had run out and the guitar had been put away because the strings had dulled under memory, I heard it. A call. It was not an animal's call. It wasn't even a human voice. It was thinner, more like a note at the back of a violin string that had been tuned too high and then allowed to sing into itself. It sounded at first like a voice saying my name, but not quite. Like a rough draft of my name, written in pencil and left to smudge. I stopped breathing to test whether the sound would go away, and when I listened, the sound came back, clearer now and wound with patience. Luke, Luke. The syllable hit air, folded, and returned. I thought Mr. Harris made a joke. I thought it was the wind. I thought 1,000 other reasonable things. But the sound kept calling, and then, like splinters in slow motion, our small elements of reality began to shift. Nina murmured that she could hear it too, like a thought leaping from my head. Maya grabbed my sleeve and whispered that the sound came from the eastern hollow, the place where the trees were older, where you could hear water but the maps called the area unverified. The hair along my arms rose like static charges. We walked toward the call because teenagers are brave in the way houses are brave. They have a lot to prove. The hollow was thick with growth so old it looked like furniture in a room where people no longer sat. The call repeated, softer, leading us like a breadcrumb trail left by something that couldn't resist being found. The ground was damp and studded with moss. It swallowed our shoes soundlessly. As we descended, the light shifted like a film losing a frame. The voice came now in overlapping layers, the sound of my name, but second voices layered under it, faint as if someone had left them behind. For a second, I heard a chorus, like children harmonizing in a church attic. Then I saw it. A leaning stump, teeth of broken roots jutting like a grin. Resting against it, someone sat. At first I thought it was a man, then realized it could barely be called that. It wore a coat stitched together from different fabrics, scraps of denim, flannel, burlap, all of them browned by weather. Its face was blank in the way that a bruise can be blank, a suggestion of features more than clear lines. It turned its head to face me, and the eyes were holes so black they acted as small gravity wells, pulling in the light. The voice, the one that had called me, was coming from the stump and from the thing and from somewhere between the roots. It kept saying my name, and now there was a patience in it that tasted like old bread and colder things. "Luke," it said, not a request but a rehearsal. I should have run. I should have been the kind of self-preserving organism that biology tends to favor. But the thing had a gentle way of folding my attention into its palm. It asked me to remember. It fed me memories like photographs, and I saw the place where my father had left one winter. A photograph of a boy too young to understand the gravity yet heavy with future absence. It showed me a creek where my sister and I had skipped stones. Each memory the thing showed me hummed with a particular kind of ache I hadn't known I'd kept in a drawer. The creature, if that was what it was, murmured that forests have grief. Trees collect things. They tape leaves into their rings. They learn names like visitors learn accents. It told me that some names stay and echo and that sometimes names need to be remembered correctly. When I tried to speak, my voice was small and away from me. "Why me?" I whispered, as if the thing could be human. It tilted its head and the sound in its chest became a wind. "You are close," it said. The grammar felt like a rusted hinge. "You come often. You carry a handful of something pure. Forgetting. We like to set things right." My heart had become a small machine that vibrated rather than pumped. The thing's words settled into me until I thought I could feel them like a new layer of skin. It told me to listen and it began to sing. Not with melody but with meaning, folding old syllables into a pattern that felt like a map. It spoke of a hollow where kids once disappeared, a place where the line between forest and world thinned. It noted things in passing, names written in bark, a watch swallowed by the roots, a lighter still warm under moss. I learned in that moment, with the thing watching patiently, that when a forest gathers sorrow, it does not do so politely. It tucks it into knots and hollows and roots. It waits for a pair of hands gentle enough to untie the grief. It paces the perimeter of what we call forgetting. When we emerged from the hollow, the rest of the group found us frozen in a line like puppets with severed strings. Mr. Harris waited, his face set to the kind of gravity that precedes parental discipline. We walked back to the ridge, the thing's words wrapping their punctuation around my tongue. I felt different in some small but seismic way, as if a layer of paint had been scraped from my bones. That night, inside my tent, I tried to write it down. I wanted to give the forest an accounting, a ledger of what it had taught me. I tried words and they came clumsy, like someone trying to translate a language spoken with leaves. I recorded nothing in the log. I feared the ink would be drunk. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the idea settle. The forest wanted something remembered, and that asking had been a soft kind of violence. We left the next day. Goodbyes at rangers' cabins are light and polite, like people putting on coats after someone's funeral. The lot was busier now, hikers with clean packs, families with small flags on their tents. The willow by the creek looked ordinary. We signed out, and as the ranger stamped the log, a new entry appeared in the margin of the same page the previous note had been written on. It read, "Don't forget the hollow." The handwriting was unfamiliar. The drive home was loud with radio and relief. We told ourselves we had been silly, that hunger and wood smoke had given the trees voices. Back in town, the routine swallowed us like a familiar couch. I went back to school, to coffee, to mowing lawns that never fixed everything. And yet, night after night, a rhythm had nested under my ribs. Every time I took a slow breath, I could hear it, someone practicing my name. Weeks later, in a drawer where I kept cords and cheap sunglasses, I found an old photograph I didn't remember taking. In the picture I was 10, my smile too quick, my arm around a boy I thought was a friend. But the boy's face was not a face I recognized. It had been smudged, as if someone had tried to edit the image after. On the back of the photograph were letters, careful and cramped. "Remember us, Luke. The writing was in a hand I couldn't quite place, round, patient, with the kind of loops that suggested someone who enjoyed staying in one place for a long time. I started to notice other things. Neighbors who walked too late with the wrong kind of speed. A kid from school, Quiet Ben, who vanished for a week and returned with fewer stories and longer pauses. A dog that used to sleep on porches that stopped barking. The town, which had seemed a sleep-tight organism, shifted and adopted small habits of looking away. The creek where we had camped reeled like someone unwell, and if you were near it at dusk, you heard. Not the call I had heard, but deeper things. The creek clearing its throat as if remembering how it had sounded the day someone last listened. The hollow followed me like a wet smell on clothes. I began to dream of the stump and the thing that had sat against it, the sketched face becoming clearer in sleep until I could almost map the place where the stitches of its coat met. Each dream ended the same way. Waking and the memory of the thing's hand, cool as river stones and insistent, closing for just a second on the back of my neck. I would jerk awake and the world would be ordinary and cruelly prosaic, with the clock proclaiming how much I had failed to rest. I told my parents. I told Mr. Harris. They smiled and gave me the kind of practical advice that tries to be a shield. Sleep earlier, stop drinking coffee at night, maybe see a counselor. They meant well. Mr. Harris gave me a pamphlet on mindfulness. My father suggested I stand in the sun longer. None of it fixed the hollow inside me that had been asked to remember. One October afternoon, when the leaves were the color of bruises and the town had become a study in quiet, I walked back toward the Greenfield Range on my own. I told myself I was going to plant flags of reason and prove conclusively that I had imagined the thing. The path to the ranger's lot had become a worm of memory and new growth. The younger ranger remembered me. My name had been added to more than his log. It had been added to his curiosity. When I asked for directions to the hollow, he squinted at me, as if I had asked for a secret handshake. "You don't want to go," he said, which is ranger for, "There are things too heavy for teenagers." But persistence is a muscle I'd been working. He sighed and gave me coordinates with an admonishing set of words. "Don't wander. Don't take anything. Don't bring a camera." That last line made me laugh, the sort of bitter, thin laugh that means you feel anything but prepared. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated and then said, "Because things happen to things you bring. They change their minds." I spent the day with a map in my hand and a fruit bar in my bag and a heartbeat that had 2 tempos. I followed the coordinates past the creek, deeper than we had gone with the group, to a place that felt like thin glass over a larger water. The hollow was a bowl of trees, older than the rest, their trunks like columns in a ruined temple. Moss fell like faded curtains. The stump was there, older, the teeth of its roots more polished by time. The thing I had seen the night of the trip sat slumped against it, eyes black as coin holes. This time I came prepared not with arrogance but with folds of curiosity. I had a small notebook and a pencil because there are people who keep records for the living, and sometimes memory requires ink to keep it honest. The thing looked up when it heard me, and it smiled in that blank way that is both compassionate and terrifying. It didn't speak my name, not yet. Instead, it folded its hands and pushed a scrap toward me, one of those patches from its coat. On it, stitched by some careful and patient hand, were names. The thread spelled out lines that matched the loops I had seen on the photograph scraps. Names, some with dates that suggested the weight of years, some with initials, some just a single letter. I asked how long it had been keeping things, and it answered like a slow clock, with the quiet confidence of someone who measures in seasons instead of minutes. It said there were things the forest had been asked to keep, things left behind by footsteps, like toys and time and vows, things that dissolved into memory. Sometimes a name would get swallowed, and a person following would be missed. The thing's voice was like a book turning, old and inevitable. "Why my name?" I asked, and the thing blinked, considering. "Because you can hear," it said simply. Because you come and the past is soft in your mouth. Because you collect and you do not let go. It brushed a finger on my palm, and in that touch something like snow rearranged itself in my mind. A memory from when I had been small, when I had promised my sister in the rain to be brave for both of us, and then, later, the promise had been brittle and small. The thing asked me to help. It did not demand. It requested in the way a family asks a story to be told at dinner. Names, it said, need to be right. They like to be pronounced the same way they were at the beginning. Will you help say them? It showed me a list, stitched into a strip of fabric. 12 names, some with years, some with nothing but letters. I felt my mouth shape each one like coin. I learned the ritual there. It was small and careful. Speak the name, tell a memory aloud, lay a stone or a twig, and say thank you. The thing taught me how to listen to the way the syllables wanted to be spoken. Some names required a soft vowel. Others needed a rough cut. The forest rewarded this bookkeeping with a small grace. After a name was spoken properly, birds returned to that corner and a sound would unspool like a released breath. The first one I said belonged to a child, Marty, who had been missing in our town's old whisper for decades. I had heard the name in half-remembered gossip at the market. I said it as the thing showed me how, nothing grand, only a soft statement of existence. The next day, when I walked through town in a way that felt less like sneaking and more like a man carrying a lantern, I found a plaque propped in the library. Library records locked in the kind of bureaucratic dust that doesn't always tell the whole story. Inside was a small notice, a note from a family, an update that read, "Found. Marty." The town had never had reason to celebrate such an ordinary, impossible victory. I felt like someone who had finally returned a book to a shelf and found the dust disappeared. Word spread, but not in the sense of a modern shout. People with soft ears and hearts that kept things like buttons started showing up at the ranger station, each with a name that wouldn't leave them alone. The ranger I had talked to became someone who passed along directions in low words. They came with bracelets, with poems, with the ripped collars of shirts they could no longer wear without remembering. Some names were happy returns. Some remained stubbornly asleep. It wasn't a miracle factory. There are aches that cannot be petitioned back into being. But there were enough small recoveries that the town's nights felt less haunted. But the work changed me in ways ordinary tasks never do. There is the iron law people forget. When you enter someone else's grief, it will ask something of you. The forest never asked anything too large. It simply asked consistency, to show up, to speak, to hold the syllables with respect. Over the next months, I made the hike regularly, each time taking names, reading losses like litany, laying stones, sometimes painting letters on bark with a trembling hand until a name felt settled again. I would return to town with dirt under my nails and the smell of pine in my clothes. There were costs. Dreams doubled in length. School blurred. People asked questions, friends and family who wanted to know why I seemed older, and I would shrug or avoid the history teacher's gaze. Mr. Harris congratulated me with a quiet nod and a suggestion that maybe I should keep it to myself. People whispered still. There are always whispers when the world's edges get rearranged. They called me eccentric. They called me brave. I felt both a steward and a thief. Then came the night the hollow wanted more than remembrance. It was early winter, the kind where breath hangs in the air like small ghosts, and the snow was a promise kept for a day. The list had grown long and one name remained resistant. A woman, Amelia P., born in the 1950s, who had wandered into the hollow and never returned. Her name had been stitched on a strip and hung in the cold. The thing told me she was a hard name, difficult to coax from the air. She left angry, it said. Some depart not because they are lost, but because they are carrying away something that belongs here. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks when it said it. It had learned the faces of people who leave slamming doors behind them. I prepared in my pragmatic way. I wrapped my coat tight and took enough food for 2 nights and a lantern with extra batteries. I took the list and the stone I always carried, smooth, river-worn, with a nick like a small smile. The hollow waited, a bowl of trees like a mouth ready to receive. Snow muffled my steps. It made it easier and more dangerous to be quiet. As I approached the stump, the thing sat propped like a sentinel. The air smelled like old paper and iron. I unrolled the strip where Amelia's name loomed. I had rehearsed her name under my breath for days, finding the syllables like keys that fit into a lock. I called it loud enough that the snow could carry it and the trees could learn the cadence. Amelia Penrose, I said, and the world echoed like an empty well. For a second, nothing. Then a wind picked up and the stump seemed to inhale. The thing stood slow, groaning with complaint. And then, in a movement that belonged more to ceremony than to motion, it approached. Its hands were hands but longer, their joints a little too geometrically arranged. Touched the strip with care. It reached into the fabric and pulled out a small object wrapped in oilskin. It handed me the object, a watch. It was old, with a glass face scratched like the surface of a lake in winter. The hands were stopped at 3:17. When I unwrapped it, stuck to its back, there was a note with a date and a name. Amelia. The watch had no power, but it kept time in the way memories do, frozen moments that folks try to carry around. When I touched the watch, an image flashed through me. A small arguing with a man with a flat hat, a burned kettle, Amelia's hands washing something in a basin, and then, suddenly, a sled on a hill and an accidental step where the world thinned. You found it, I said, because words had become a ritual that bound the present to the past. The thing nodded and a sound like a page turning escaped it. Some things do not want to be found. They become pockets. But you have been faithful. Its voice mattered less than the motion. Even when it did not speak, the thing made the air stand still like a crowd rising. That night, I took the watch back to town and found a granddaughter of a neighbor, an old woman who smelled of tea and copper, who took one look at the object and began to weep. She folded it into her hands as if reading Braille, as if feeling the edges of a name. My grandmother, she said, voice thin as paper. She never spoke of this night. Her tears were angry at time and glad at last. I learned then that what the hollow returned was not always literal resurrection, but a chance to anneal a wound with the salve of being remembered. But something else shifted. The more I returned things, the more the hollow learned how to want. It began to ask for names of people who were not so much missing as forgotten. Neighbors who had moved away, small acts that had gone unsaid, apologies swallowed and left to ferment. The requests started small and decently posed. Then they grew in specificity and index. One night it asked me for the name of a man who had once owned a barn on the outskirts of town and had left a letter in the attic. He had never been reported missing, but the hollow wanted his name said right. I said it, and the next day, someone found a trunk with a letter underneath a stack of quilts. The town breathed out and in with these small recitations, and a new habit slotting in seemed to ease the hollow's appetite. The trees seemed gentler. Children were less often lost for minutes and more for the anxiety that comes with new phones. People placed stones on little shapeless piles and whispered names as if saying them aloud could turn them from smoke to something you could hold. Then, in spring, something different came. A man with a tie who said he worked for a company that made maps. He had seen the change in our town. People coming to the ranger's lot with paper lists were a metric he could not ignore. He wanted to map the phenomenon, to find coordinates and place icons and call them events. He meant no harm. He wore the world in the way men do who cleanse things with charts, convinced that knowing the angle of a thing is equivalent to taking it in hand. I let him tag along as I walked the hollow with my list. He carried instruments that beeped and recorded and were polite about intrusion. We reached the stump and he took notes and declared that something was anomalous but not necessarily supernatural. He asked me to say a name. I did not want to sound silly in front of his instruments, but I was patient and I spoke anyway. We said a name, Jonathan L., an old logger no one could remember. The man in the tie started his recorder, and as the syllable left my teeth, the devices started to misbehave. The mapmaker frowned. The star on his screen blinked and then the battery level dropped overnight. An ordinary thing suddenly made conspiratorial. He laughed and called it interference. I felt the hollow's presence like a hand on my sleeve. Not cruel, but insistently attentive. That night, the mapmaker's van was found at the edge of the lot. Its engine cold and its front windshield spiderwebbed with frost that mapped out the world into different, crystalline paths. The man was not inside. They found his recorder in a ditch, its memory full of noises that could not be made by ordinary humans. Stretched out vowels and the sound of stone knocked gently as if one were counting sheep into a well. The town called the curiosity a lost man and then an accident. And then, among the whispered theories, someone suggested the hollow had taken him. Rumor has a way of being a sticky thing. The more we worked for the hollow, the more it wanted things in the form of acknowledgement. It began to ask for names without giving them back. It wanted stories we would rather forget. Secrets tucked into corners of our lives that had once felt like protection. It wanted confessions. I should have seen the pattern then, but I was young and valorous in the precise way the forest had described, willing to show up when needed. One evening, as late summer shrank into the kind of cool that makes you think of coats, the hollow asked me for a name that was not in our list. It asked for someone who had never been missing. The name appeared on the strip like a small, malicious seed. Ben Mercer. Ben, the quiet kid from school who had seemed to carry a polite rain cloud with him. Ben had returned from a week of wandering with the kind of silence that felt heavy as a folded map. I had seen Ben's face in the school corridors. He had pale eyes and the habit of looking at walls as if they might answer back. When I told the hollow his name and stood under the old trees to speak it correctly, the thing pressed its hands together in a way that suggested prayer. It handed me a scrap and told me to return the following day for proof that the name had been satisfied. The next morning, Ben was missing. The police did their rituals. Officers with pads, questions that begin and fail, parents who speak the same few words until the lack of answers rings like a bell. Folks said he had left of his own accord. Others whispered that someone had taken him. I felt the hollow's fingers wrench, gently, but in the way something becomes a habit by pulling a thread. I had spoken his name and the forest had wanted him acknowledged. It had decided that the best way to ensure the name was said properly was to adjust the world to fit. The logic felt brutal and efficient. We hunted. We searched the creek and the hollow and the edges of field that had once seemed safe. We found nothing but a hat on a log and the smell of the woodland damp. People who had once complimented my stewardship now accused me in the market with the kind of sharpness that wants an answer. Mr. Harris stopped returning calls. The ranger said the forest was wild, not responsible for what people did to themselves. He refused to help beyond consolation. Ben did not return. The town put up posters, and Ben's mother sat at his bedroom window and stared at a place that had not yet learned to hold absence. The hollow's requests became darker after that night. It asked for names, and it asked for things like, the song you hummed in the kitchen when you told yourself you were brave, or the first lie your father ever told you. It thirsted for the memory itself, and memory tends to be the reservoir the living draw from when their edges are frayed. I stopped going as often. When I did go, I found the stump sitting neatly with its coat folded, like a clean handkerchief. The thing would look at me with a tired thing body and ask me for another name, and each request pushed the line between remembering and being complicit in someone else's erasure. The hollow answered in small pieces. A photograph found, a watch returned, a memory softened. Then it would demand a more intimate currency. The truth behind someone's speech, the private names of lovers, the scattered small humiliations people tuck under their beds. One night, on a bridge where the creek cut the town in two, Ben's mother found me. She had a look that made the world tilt into action. The town had learned to pin blame because blame gives something to do with grief. She accused me in the way grief does, fast and meaning every word. "You knew," she said. "You knew more than you said." I tried to explain that I had not known and that the hollow had its own logic and that some names return and some take, but the rationalization sounded like a defense in a courtroom of breath. She left me with a piece of paper, a name I had not seen before and a threat folded between the lines. The hollow's appetite continued to grow. It wanted acknowledgement for things that would make us small. In a town like ours, secrets are a kind of currency, and the hollow had suddenly become a machine that wanted to exchange them for its own balance. I watched doors close tighter. Friends sidled away. Parents lowered their eyes when their children asked where Ben had gone. On a night when the moon was a coin tossed into a wishing well, I went to the hollow to ask it if it understood what it had done. The thing listened. It did not answer in anger or sorrow. It simply said in a voice like wet paper that people forget and forgettings grow into monsters. It said that sometimes the thing you fix will fix you back, but sometimes the fixing requires taking. It did not smile. "You want to stop?" I asked, or I might as well have asked the sky to stop turning, because the hollow was a law of nature now, unwieldy and patient. "You can stop," it said. "You must choose what remembering means." The truth was unbearable. The hollow had been a teacher, and a cruel one. Memories had been given back to people who needed them, yes, but in a way that had traded complications for neat conclusions. The hollow had decided that the only way to make names right was to reset the ledger, which sometimes resembled a ledger written by a clerk who had been scalded. I had thought myself a steward, but I realized I had been an accessory to a process that considered certain things collateral. I left that night exhausted, my feet carrying me through a world that looked like the inside of a tired coin. I had one choice left. I could keep helping, keep making the lists, risking more vanishings performed like small arithmetic, or I could stop and let the forest hold its own contents, a place of grief like a closed drawer. I made other choices. I told the ranger that I was done. I burned my lists in the creek where the water could carry the ash. I apologized in the way you apologize to a being you do not deeply understand, quietly with whatever language fit the moment. I told the hollow I would stop speaking names and that I would train myself to forget the way you train a dog to not greet the mailman. I tried to step back into ordinary life like a swimmer who'd been pulled under and then released. For a while, life eased thinly, like a pulled thread settling. The town mended and did not at the same speed. Some curiosities remained, and the old hole in the map kept its shadow. The stump still stood in the hollow, but without the same invitation in its posture. I thought the forest had learned to stop asking for such heavy currency. But memory is not a commodity you spend without consequence. Months later, after weather and time had scoured the edges of things, I received a letter. It was a thin, typed thing from an address associated with a company the mapmaker had mentioned, the kind of business that charts things for a living. Inside was an apology and some numbers, then a statement that they had found something on an old recording that corresponded to my name. The letter was careful and apologetic and claimed that the man in the tie had gone missing and that the company had been investigating privately. The letter ended with a sentence heavy with corporate guilt. "We are sorry for your loss." I realized I was not the only one who had been changed. The hollow had taught me trade, the exchange of names for presents, and I had tried to ask it to restrain itself and it had not. In the end, the answers we got were not neat. Ben was never found. Some people received returns, but not in the tidy way life used to deliver solace. More so as strange happenstances that left them with stories and a subtler ache. Years later, I still walk the creek on sun-clear days. I carry no list now. When I pass the ranger's cabin, I nod at the station. Sometimes someone I did not know will ask me if I go there, and I will say no, that I no longer make the pilgrimage because there are bargains one should not make with the wild. They nod or they do not. Some people have an itch for a solution and others do not. My own hands have learned the shape of ordinary tasks again. Mending a fence, working a mower. But when the dusk comes and the town folds its shoulders against the dark like an animal settling, I often hear a voice that is only the memory of a voice, and my name shifts in the throat of the wind. If there's a moral here, it's not a neat one. Maybe it's that places remember and that memory is not always benevolent. Maybe it's that sometimes helping means knowing when to stop, and sometimes that lesson comes too late. If you ever find yourself in a place where trees look like columns and a stump holds more patience than your neighbors, be careful what you promise. Names are heavy. Saying them out loud may be bringing someone home, or it might be opening a door no one asked to open. So go home, make your coffee, tell your small lies to the cat. Sleep. If the wind plays your name through the eaves tonight, answer it softly and then fall back to what is ordinary. Do not go seeking hollows with lists in your pockets. The forest already keeps enough things, and if, on some rare and bad night, you find a stump with a coat folded against it, do not be too quick to say the name stitched into its cover. Remember that some memories want to be left to the dark because they weren't meant to be traded, and some names are the kind that once said, "Ask for a price you cannot pay."